You are on HOA busted. The mailbox cluster heard every threat. You are on the record now. That is what Courtney Taylor screamed at me as she shoved a laminated rule sheet against my chest, her finger stabbing at a clause about fence styles, her voice loud enough that the dog walker across the street stopped and pulled out her phone. I had maybe 3 seconds to process what was happening before Courtney demanded I agree, right there on my driveway, to tear down the fence I had just finished installing 2 days earlier. I am a licensed electrician, I work long shifts, and I had spent an entire weekend measuring setbacks, checking the survey pins, and following every rule I could find in the Cedar Point Fence Compliance Association handbook. But none of that mattered to Courtney, because she had decided my fence style was prohibited, and she was the finance committee lead, and in her mind that gave her the authority to rewrite reality. I live in Fargo, North Dakota, in a neighborhood where rules are not guidance, they are leverage. Cedar Point is one of those places where the HOA name sounds peaceful but the enforcement is surgical. I moved here 6 months ago because the rent was cheaper than my old place, and I needed space for my younger brother, who is disabled and needs daily care. I cannot afford towing fees, I cannot afford a credit hit from collections, and I cannot afford to have Courtney Taylor park a tow truck in my driveway and create a crisis, while I am trying to keep my brother safe and my job stable. But Courtney did not care about any of that. She cared about control. Courtney held the laminated sheet like a shield. This conversation is not a debate, it is a directive, she said. Her voice was clipped and loud. She tapped the clause again. Your fence style violates Section 12-4-C. You have horizontal rails visible from the street side. That is prohibited. You agreed to this when you closed on the property. I kept my voice calm. I said I had read Section 12-4-C 3 times, and it specified that fences must be uniform in height and material, but it said nothing about rail orientation. Courtney snorted. She said the board had clarified that guideline in a meeting last year, and if I had attended meetings like a responsible homeowner, I would know that. I asked her to show me the meeting minutes. She said they were not public yet. I asked her when they would be public. She said that was not my concern. I asked her if she had a copy of the clarification in writing. She pulled a folded paper from her crossbody bag and waved it in front of my face, but did not let me touch it. She said this was a contractor business card with the approved fence vendor contact information, and if I used anyone else, I was non-compliant by default. I told her I had used a licensed contractor who pulled a city permit. She said city permits do not override HOA covenants. She said I had 48 hours to submit a removal plan, or the association would begin daily fines at $100 per day. Then she turned and walked back toward the street, her bag swinging, her shoulders tight with satisfaction. The dog walker across the street was still filming. I did not know her name yet, but I made a mental note to find her later, because I had a feeling this was just the beginning. That night I pulled every document I had. The purchase agreement, the closing disclosure, the HOA covenant packet, the fence permit from the city, the contractor invoice, and the receipt for the materials. I laid them all out on my kitchen table and went line by line. Section 12-4-C said fences must be 6 feet or shorter, wood or composite, stained or painted in earth tones, and installed at least 2 feet inside the property line to allow for utility access. My fence checked every box. There was no mention of rail orientation. There was no mention of approved vendors. There was no addendum, no clarification, no board vote documented anywhere in the packet I had received at closing. I opened my email and found the thread from March, when I had asked the HOA management company for a fence approval form. They had sent me a PDF checklist. I had filled it out, submitted photos of my proposed design, and received an email back that said approved pending city permit. I had saved that email. I had printed it. I had filed it. I pulled it out now and read it again. It was signed by the management company representative, and it had no conditions, no footnotes, no warnings about rail orientation or vendor restrictions. But none of that mattered if Courtney decided to ignore it. I had learned that much in 6 months. Cedar Point was a place where the rules were what Courtney said they were, and the rest of us were just supposed to nod and comply. She had been finance committee lead for 3 years, and in that time she had added line items to the budget that no one could explain. She had pushed through special assessments that hit renters and new owners hardest, and she had cultivated a reputation for being untouchable. People called her the compliance officer behind her back, but no one said it to her face. I called my friend Marcus the next morning. Marcus is a local paralegal who works in landlord-tenant disputes, and he has seen every flavor of petty tyranny. I told him what had happened. He laughed, but it was not a happy laugh. He said Courtney was running a classic selective enforcement play. He said if I could prove she was targeting me while ignoring identical violations elsewhere in the neighborhood, I could force the HOA to back down or face a complaint with the state. He said I needed to document everything, photograph every fence in Cedar Point, and start building a timeline. So that is what I did. I spent my day off walking the neighborhood with my phone, taking photos of every fence I could find. I found split-rail fences with horizontal beams. I found privacy fences with decorative caps. I found chain-link fences with vinyl slats. I found one house with a fence that was 7 feet tall and painted bright red. None of them had violation notices. None of them had fines. I checked the HOA complaint log online, and there were no fence entries except mine. I saved every photo with a GPS timestamp. I made a spreadsheet. I noted the address, the fence type, the rule it supposedly violated, and the date I took the photo. By the end of the day, I had evidence of at least 9 other fences that were more out of compliance than mine, and none of them had been touched. 2 days later, I got the first fine notice. It was printed on Cedar Point letterhead, dated the day after Courtney had confronted me, and it stated that I was in violation of Section 12-4-C and owed $100 per day starting immediately. The notice said the fine would continue until I submitted a compliant removal plan and proof of contractor engagement. It said if I did not pay within 30 days, the association would pursue collections and file a lien against my property. I read that line twice. I take care of my brother full-time outside of work. He has mobility issues and needs help with daily tasks. If the HOA put a lien on my house or sent my account to collections, it could tank my credit and make it impossible to refinance or move if I needed to. That was not a theoretical problem. That was a crisis waiting to happen. I called the management company. I got a receptionist who put me on hold for 11 minutes, then transferred me to a voicemail box. I left a message explaining that I had been approved in March, that my fence was compliant, and that I needed someone to review the fine. No one called me back. I called again the next day. This time I got a different receptionist who said the management company did not handle enforcement decisions, that was the board, and I needed to submit a written appeal to the board secretary. I asked who the board secretary was. She said Courtney Taylor. I hung up and called Marcus. He said that was a textbook conflict of interest, and I needed to go over Courtney's head. He said I should request the meeting minutes for the last 2 years, request the vote records for any fence policy changes, and request the names of everyone on the board. He said if they refused, I should file a records request under North Dakota HOA law, which requires associations to provide governing documents and meeting minutes to homeowners within 10 business days. So I drafted the request. I kept it short and formal. I asked for the meeting minutes from the last 2 years, the vote records for any amendments to Section 12-4-C, and the current board roster with contact information. I sent it to the management company email and CC'd Courtney. 3 hours later, Courtney called me. Her voice was icy. She said I was wasting everyone's time with frivolous requests. She said the clarification about fence styles had been discussed verbally at a meeting I had not attended, and it was my responsibility to stay informed. I asked her which meeting. She said October of last year. I told her I had not owned the house in October of last year. She paused, then said the previous owner should have informed me. I told her that was not how disclosures work. She said this conversation was over and hung up. That night I got an email from the management company. It said my records request had been received and would be processed within the statutory time frame. It said nothing about the fine, nothing about the appeal, nothing about the clarification Courtney kept referencing. The next morning I found another notice taped to my front door. This one was not about the fence. It was about the small gate hardware box I had left on my porch for 2 days while waiting for the contractor to come back and install the latch. The notice said visible clutter was prohibited under Section 9-2, and I had 24 hours to remove it or face an additional $50 fine. I stared at the notice. The hardware box was maybe 12 inches wide, tucked against the house, barely visible from the street. But Courtney had walked up to my porch, taken a photo, and generated a violation notice within hours. That was when I realized this was not about the fence. This was about breaking me. Courtney wanted me to give up, pay the fines, tear down the fence, and accept that she was in charge. She wanted me to be an example. And she was willing to pile on violations, escalate fines, and weaponize every clause in the handbook to make it happen. I moved the hardware box into my garage. Then I called Marcus again. I told him about the clutter notice. He said we needed to go nuclear. He said I should file a formal complaint with the management company, request an in-person board meeting, and bring every piece of evidence I had. He said if the board refused to meet or if Courtney tried to shut me down, I should record everything and escalate to an attorney consult. If you are enjoying this story, smash that like button and subscribe for more HOA drama and satisfying endings. I drafted the complaint that night. I laid out the timeline, the verbal approval in March, the laminated rule sheet ambush, the fine notice with no documentation, the clutter violation that was clearly retaliatory, and the refusal to provide meeting minutes. I attached photos of the 9 other non-compliant fences in Cedar Point. I attached the approval email from the management company. I attached my permit from the city. I requested an emergency board meeting within 2 weeks. I sent the complaint to the management company, CC'd every board member email I could find, and printed 3 copies from my records. Then I waited. 4 days later, I got a response. It was not from the management company. It was from Courtney. She said my complaint had been reviewed by the finance committee, which determined that my fence remained non-compliant, and that my evidence was irrelevant because the other fences I had photographed predated the clarification. She said the board would not be holding an emergency meeting, but I could attend the next regularly scheduled meeting in 6 weeks and speak during the homeowner comment period, which was limited to 3 minutes. I read that email 3 times. Courtney had not consulted the full board. She had not provided the meeting minutes I requested. She had invented a new justification for the fines and set up a timeline that would let the daily penalties rack up to $6,000 before I even had a chance to speak. Marcus said that was when we needed to escalate. He said I should show up at the next board meeting with a witness, bring printed copies of everything, and force the issue on the record. He said if Courtney tried to shut me down or refused to let me speak, I should stay calm, document it, and take the whole package to an attorney the next day. But before I could get to that meeting, Courtney escalated first. I was at the hardware store on a Saturday, picking up materials for a small repair project, when Courtney appeared at the end of the aisle. She had her phone out, camera aimed at me, and she started talking before I could say anything. She said she was documenting my continued non-compliance, that I was purchasing additional materials in violation of the stop work directive the board had issued, and that this would be added to my file. I told her I had never received a stop work directive. She said it had been mailed to me. I told her I checked my mail every day and there was nothing. She said that was my problem, not hers. Other shoppers were staring. An older man with a cart full of paint cans stopped and asked if everything was okay. Courtney turned to him and said this was HOA business and he should move along. The man looked at me, looked at Courtney, then slowly pushed his cart past us. Courtney kept filming. She said I was making this harder than it needed to be, that I was not the first person she had corrected and I would not be the last, and that if I continued to resist, the association had legal options. I kept my voice low, because my trump card needed perfect timing. I told Courtney I was purchasing materials for a separate project that had nothing to do with the fence, and that she was harassing me in a public space. She laughed. She said harassment required intent, and her intent was enforcement. She said I could file a complaint if I wanted, but the board would side with her like they always did. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, her phone still recording. I stood there with my cart, my hands shaking, while a store employee approached and asked if I needed security. I said no. I said it was handled. But it was not handled. It was just beginning. That night I got another email. This one had an attachment, a compliance log entry dated 3 days earlier, written in Courtney's unmistakable voice. It said I had been observed making hostile comments toward HOA leadership, that I had refused multiple directives, and that the board was considering a formal cease and desist letter. The log entry was obviously written by Courtney, but it was filed as an official board document. Marcus said that was gold. He said if Courtney was writing official complaints in the first person and filing them without board approval, that was misconduct. He said I should keep that email, flag it as evidence, and add it to the package I was building for the attorney. But before I could organize everything, Courtney made her biggest move. I came home from work on a Tuesday afternoon to find a tow truck idling in front of my house. The driver was standing on my driveway looking at my car, and Courtney was next to him with a clipboard, pointing at my front tire and talking fast. I parked on the street and walked over. I asked what was going on. Courtney said my vehicle was parked in violation of Section 7-3, which prohibited commercial vehicles from overnight parking in driveways, and the board had authorized a tow. I told her my car was not a commercial vehicle. It was a sedan. She said the magnetic decal on the door with my company logo made it commercial. I looked at the decal. It was 6 inches wide, removable, and I had put it on 3 months ago because my boss offered a small gas stipend for employees who displayed the company name. I told Courtney that was absurd. She said the rules were the rules. The tow driver looked uncomfortable. He said he needed proof of authorization before he could tow. Courtney pulled a printed letter from her crossbody bag and handed it to him. He read it, frowned, then looked at me. He said the letter was signed by the HOA board president, but it did not have a date or a case number. He said he could not tow without both. Courtney turned red. She told the driver to do his job. He said he was doing his job and his job required proper documentation. Courtney said she would call his supervisor. The driver shrugged and said go ahead. Then he climbed back into his truck, put it in gear, and drove away. Courtney stood on my driveway for another 30 seconds, staring at me. Then she said this was not over, turned on her heel and walked back toward the street. I watched her go. My hands were still shaking. My brother was inside the house, and if that truck had actually hooked my car, I would have had no way to get him to his physical therapy appointment the next morning. That was the moment I decided to stop playing defense. Courtney wanted a fight on the record. Fine, I would give her one. I called Marcus and told him everything. He said the tow attempt was the leverage I needed. He said I should file a police report for attempted vehicle theft, request a copy of the tow authorization letter Courtney had flashed, and demand an emergency board meeting within 72 hours, or I would escalate to an attorney and file a formal complaint with the state. I did all of that. I went to the Fargo Police Department that night and filed a report. The officer who took my statement said the tow driver had done the right thing by refusing to proceed without proper documentation, and that if Courtney tried again, I should call 911 immediately. He gave me an incident number and a printed copy of the report. Then he said, off the record, that he had dealt with Cedar Pointe before, and Courtney Taylor was known for pushing boundaries. I took that incident number and added it to my evidence folder. Then I sent another email to the management company, this time with the police report attached. I said I was requesting an emergency board meeting within 72 hours to address the following issues: the invalid fence fine, the retaliatory clutter violation, the unauthorized tow attempt, and the fraudulent compliance log entry. I said if the board refused to meet, I would be consulting an attorney and filing a complaint with the North Dakota Real Estate Commission, which oversees HOA management companies. I said Courtney. I said every board member. I said Marcus. This time I got a response within 2 hours. It was from the board president, a man named Ed who I had never met. He said the board took my concerns seriously and would be convening an emergency session on Thursday evening at 7 p.m. in the Cedar Pointe Clubhouse. He said I would be given 10 minutes to present my case, and the board would vote on next steps. That gave me 2 days. Marcus helped me organize the evidence packet. We printed everything: the approval email from March, the photos of the 9 non-compliant fences, the fine notices, the clutter violation, the compliance log entry, the police report, the tow authorization letter I had requested through a follow-up records request and finally received that morning, and a T-year timeline that laid out every escalation step Courtney had taken. We put it all in a 3-ring binder with labeled tabs. Marcus said I should bring 3 copies, one for me, one for the board, and one for my records. Thursday night I walked into the Cedar Pointe Clubhouse at 6:55 p.m. The room was set up with a folding table at the front and rows of chairs facing it. Courtney was already there, sitting at the table with Ed and 2 other board members I did not recognize. She did not look at me when I walked in. She was staring at her phone, her jaw tight. Marcus sat in the back row. He had a notebook and a pen. He nodded at me when I glanced over. Ed called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. He said this was an emergency session to address homeowner concerns raised by me, and that I would have 10 minutes to speak. He said the board would then discuss the matter in executive session and reconvene with a decision. I stood up and walked to the front. I set the binder on the table and opened it to the timeline tab. I said I wanted to start with the facts, and I wanted everything on the record. I said I had purchased my home in March. I had submitted a fence design for approval. I had received written approval from the management company. I had pulled a city permit. I had installed the fence in compliance with every documented rule, and I had been ambushed 2 days later by Courtney Taylor with a laminated rule sheet and a threat of immediate fines. I turned to the next tab and pulled out the photos of the 9 other fences. I said Courtney had claimed my fence violated a clarification that had been made at a board meeting in October of the previous year, but I had requested the meeting minutes for that session, and had not received them. I said I had documented 9 other fences in Cedar Pointe that were more out of compliance than mine, and none of them had been fined. I said that was selective enforcement, and it violated North Dakota HOA law. Courtney interrupted. She said the other fences predated the clarification and were grandfathered. I asked her to show me the documentation of that grandfathering. She said it was in the meeting minutes. I said I had requested the meeting minutes and had not received them. She said I should have attended the meeting. I said I did not own the house at that time. Ed held up a hand. He said we needed to keep this orderly. He asked Courtney if she had the meeting minutes from October. She hesitated, then said they were still being finalized. Ed frowned. He said the meeting was over a year ago. Courtney said the board secretary had been slow with transcription. I turned to the next tab and pulled out the compliance log entry. I said this was a document Courtney had written in the first person and filed as an official board record without a vote. I said that was misconduct. Courtney said it was standard procedure for the Finance Committee lead to document compliance issues. I said the Finance Committee did not have enforcement authority. Ed asked Courtney if that was true. She said the board had delegated enforcement to the Finance Committee last year. Ed said he did not remember that vote. Then I pulled out the tow authorization letter and the police report. I said Courtney had attempted to have my vehicle towed without proper documentation, and the tow driver had refused because the letter was missing a date and a case number. I said I had filed a police report, and the officer had confirmed that the attempt could be considered vehicle theft. I said Courtney had acted without board approval and had created a liability for the association. Courtney stood up. Her voice was loud. She said I was twisting the facts, that I was wasting everyone's time, and that the board needed to move forward with enforcement or Cedar Point would descend into chaos. She said this conversation is not a debate, it is a directive, and the board needed to back her up. Ed looked at the other two board members. One of them, a woman in her 60s, said she had not approved a tow. The other, a man in his 40s, said he had not even known about the fence issue until my email on Tuesday. Ed turned to Courtney and asked her who had authorized the tow. Courtney said she had, as Finance Committee lead. Ed said that was not how it worked. Then Marcus stood up in the back row. He said he wanted to add one more thing to the record. He said he had reviewed the Cedar Point bylaws, and he had found that the board had not met quorum for the last 3 meetings, which meant any votes taken during those meetings were invalid. He said if the fence clarification had been voted on during one of those meetings, it was not enforceable. The room went silent. Ed asked Marcus how he knew that. Marcus said the bylaws required 5 board members for quorum, and the meeting minutes I had finally received that morning only listed 4 attendees for the last 3 sessions. Ed pulled out his phone and scrolled through something. Then he looked at Courtney. He said, "Is that true?" Courtney said the bylaws allowed for proxy votes. Marcus said the bylaws did not mention proxies anywhere. Ed closed his laptop. He said the board needed to go into executive session. He said I should wait outside. I picked up my binder and walked to the hallway. Marcus followed. We sat on a bench outside the clubhouse and waited. 20 minutes later, Ed opened the door and asked me to come back in. I sat down. Ed said the board had reviewed the evidence and had come to the following conclusions. First, the fence clarification Courtney had referenced did not appear in any meeting minutes, and without documentation, it could not be enforced. Second, the tow authorization letter was invalid because it had been issued without board approval. Third, the compliance log entry was inappropriate and would be removed from my file. Fourth, the fines would be rescinded and refunded in full. He said the board would be conducting an internal review of enforcement procedures, and Courtney would be stepping down as Finance Committee lead effective immediately. Courtney stood up. Her face was red. She said this was a mistake, that the board was setting a precedent that would destroy Cedar Pointy, and that she would be filing a formal complaint with the management company. Ed said she was welcome to do that, but the decision was final. Courtney grabbed her crossbody bag, shoved her phone into it, and walked out. The door slammed behind her. Ed turned to me and said I could go home. He said the board would be sending a formal letter within 48 hours confirming the decision. He apologized for the trouble. I thanked him, picked up my binder, and walked out with Marcus. In the parking lot, Marcus laughed and said that was the cleanest takedown he had seen in years. He said Courtney had handed me every piece of evidence I needed by going on the record with her own voice. He said the quorum issue was the nail in the coffin, and the board had no choice but to fold. I drove home and sat in my driveway for a few minutes, staring at the fence. It looked fine. It looked normal. It looked like every other privacy fence in North Dakota. But Courtney had tried to turn it into a weapon, and she had lost. The next morning I got an email from Ed with the formal decision letter attached. It confirmed everything he had said at the meeting. The fines were rescinded, the compliance log entry was removed, and Courtney was no longer finance committee lead. The letter also included a no-contact directive, which stated that Courtney was prohibited from initiating any enforcement actions against me without full board approval, and any violations of that directive would result in removal from the board. I printed the letter and added it to my binder. 2 weeks later, I got a check in the mail from the Cedar Point Management Company. It was for $600, the full amount of the fines plus a $50 administrative fee refund. I deposited it the same day. But the story did not end there. 3 weeks after the board meeting, I was checking my mail when I saw Courtney standing on the sidewalk corner by the Cedar Point entrance sign. She was holding her phone, filming the sign, and talking to herself. I walked over, keeping my distance. I asked her what she was doing. She said she was documenting violations. I asked what violations. She said the sign had graffiti. I looked at the sign. There was no graffiti. She said it was subtle and I probably could not see it from where I was standing. I told her she was still under a no-contact directive. She said the directive applied to enforcement actions against me, not general community documentation. I said if she filed any complaint involving me or my property, I would escalate to the board and the attorney I had consulted after the tow attempt. She said I was being paranoid. Then she turned and walked away. I called Marcus. He said Courtney was testing the boundaries, and I needed to shut it down immediately. He said I should file a formal complaint with the board, reference the no-contact directive, and request that Courtney be removed from the board entirely if she violated it again. He said I should also request that the board conduct a full audit of the finance committee records for the last 3 years, because if Courtney had been adding line items without approval, there might be other issues buried in the budget. I drafted the complaint that night. I kept it short. Courtney had approached me on the sidewalk, had attempted to provoke a confrontation, and had implied she was still gathering evidence for future enforcement. I said this violated the spirit of the no-contact directive, and I was requesting the board take immediate action. I sent the complaint to Ed and CC'd the full board. The next morning, Ed called me. He said the board had discussed Courtney at their last meeting, and they were already planning to conduct a finance audit because several homeowners had raised questions about budget discrepancies. He said my complaint had been added to the file, and the board would be voting on Courtney's continued membership at the next meeting. 2 weeks later, Ed sent me another email. He said the board had voted to remove Courtney from all committees and had requested her resignation from the board. He said the finance audit had revealed multiple unapproved expenditures and several line items that could not be traced to invoices or contracts. He said the association was consulting an attorney about next steps. I saved the email and showed it to Marcus. He said I should send one more records request, this time asking for the full finance audit report once it was completed. He said if Courtney had committed fraud, the association might pursue legal action, and I would want that documentation in case she ever tried to retaliate again. I sent the request the next day. By the time summer arrived, Cedar Point had a new finance committee lead, a new board secretary, and a revised enforcement policy that required all compliance actions to be approved by a majority board vote before any notices were issued. The policy also included a clause prohibiting retaliatory enforcement and requiring the board to document the rationale for any selective enforcement decisions. I got a copy of the revised policy in my mailbox, along with a letter from Ed thanking me for bringing the issues to the board's attention. He said Cedar Point was committed to fair enforcement and transparency, and he hoped I felt the matter had been resolved. I did, but I also knew that without the evidence Marcus had helped me organize, without the police report from the tow attempt, and without the quorum issue that exposed the invalid votes, Courtney would still be finance committee lead, and I would still be fighting daily fines. One Saturday afternoon in July, I was replacing a section of the fence that had been damaged by a windstorm when I noticed the dog walker who had filmed Courtney's initial confrontation walking past my house. I waved her over. Her name was Angela, and she said she had been hoping to run into me. She said she had been in Cedar Point for 8 years, and Courtney had targeted at least a dozen homeowners during that time, mostly new owners and renters. She said most people just paid the fines and moved on because they did not know they could fight back. I told her about the board meeting, the quorum issue, and the finance audit. She said she wished she had known all that years ago. Then she said something I had not expected. She said 3 other homeowners had filed complaints against Courtney in the last month, all citing the new enforcement policy and referencing my case as precedent. She said the HOA was changing, and it was because I had refused to back down. Angela thanked me and walked away. I went back to the fence repair, but I kept thinking about what she had said. I had not set out to change the HOA. I had just wanted to protect my home and my brother. But by refusing to let Courtney steamroll me, I had cracked open the door for other people to push back, and now the HOA was being forced to follow its own rules instead of using them as leverage. That felt like a win. In August, I got the finance audit report. It was 63 pages long, and it documented 3 years of unapproved expenditures, missing invoices, and line items that had been added to the budget without board votes. The total amount of questionable spending was over $40,000. The report recommended the association consult an attorney and consider filing a complaint with the state. I printed the report and added it to my binder. Then I sent a copy to Marcus. He said this was the kind of thing that could result in criminal charges if the attorney found evidence of embezzlement. He said I should keep my distance and let the board handle it, but I should also keep a close eye on any updates in case Courtney tried to blame me for the audit. I never heard from Courtney again. She resigned from the board in September and her name disappeared from the Cedar Point website. I heard through Angela that Courtney had moved to a different neighborhood outside Fargo, but I never verified it. I did not care. She was gone, and the HOA had new leadership that actually followed the rules. The fence is still standing. I walk past it every morning when I leave for work, and I see it every evening when I come home. It is 6 feet tall, wood construction, stained in a natural cedar tone, and set back 2 feet from the property line. It is compliant with every rule in the Cedar Point Covenant, and it has been since the day it was installed. But more than that, it is proof that you can fight back when an HOA decides to weaponize its rules. You can document everything, build a case, and force them to follow their own bylaws. You can expose misconduct, invalid votes, and selective enforcement. You can turn their own paper trail against them. And sometimes, if you are lucky, you can get a finance audit that blows the whole thing wide open and forces real accountability. In October, the board held a special meeting to present the new enforcement policy to the full membership. I attended, along with Marcus and Angela. The room was packed. Ed stood at the front and explained the changes. All enforcement actions required board approval. All meeting minutes would be posted online within 10 days, and all finance expenditures over $500 required a documented vote. Then, Ed said something I had not expected. He said the board wanted to recognize a homeowner who had brought critical issues to their attention and had helped Cedar Point become a more transparent and accountable community. He said my name. The room applauded. I did not stand up. I just nodded and smiled. Marcus leaned over and said I should have brought a speech. I said I did not need a speech. The fence was enough. After the meeting, 3 different homeowners came up to me and thanked me for what I had done. One of them said she had been planning to move because Courtney had targeted her for a mailbox violation, but now she felt like she could stay. Another said he had been documenting HOA overreach for years and had never known how to escalate it. He asked if he could get a copy of the evidence packet I had used at the board meeting. I said I would send him a template. As I walked back to my car that night, I thought about the moment Courtney had shoved the laminated rule sheet at my chest and demanded I agree to tear down the fence. I thought about the daily fines, the tow attempt, the hardware store confrontation, and the compliance log entry written in her own voice. I thought about how close I had come to just giving up and paying the fines because I did not have the time or the energy to fight. But I had fought, and I had won. Not because I had hired an expensive attorney or because I had filed a lawsuit, but because I had documented everything, built a paper trail, and forced the HOA to follow its own rules. I had used a records request that exposed contradictions and edits, and I had leveraged a quorum violation that invalidated months of enforcement actions. And in the end, Courtney had lost her committee role immediately, and the HOA had stopped selective enforcement after complaints piled up. The trump card I had held back, the one I had teased but never revealed until the final moment, was an HOA attorney email I had received 2 days before the board meeting. Marcus had helped me reach out to the attorney the association had used in the past, and I had sent him a summary of the enforcement timeline, the invalid votes, and the tow attempt. The attorney had responded with a short, brutal email. He said he would not be representing the association in any enforcement actions related to my case. Because the misconduct was so clear that it created liability he was not willing to take on. I had handed the officer on scene the proof and asked for an incident number immediately after the tow attempt, and that incident number had been the key that unlocked everything else. Without it, the board might have dismissed the tow as a misunderstanding. With it, they had no choice but to treat it as a serious liability. That email from the attorney was the trump card, and I had deployed it at the board meeting by including it in the evidence packet, with a sticky note that said page 47. Ed had flipped to that page during the executive session, and when he came back out, his entire tone had changed. That night, as I stood on my driveway and looked at the fence one more time, I realized that the fight had never really been about the fence. It had been about power. Courtney had tried to use the HOA as a weapon to control me, to punish me for not falling in line, and to make an example out of me for the rest of Cedar Pointe. But she had overplayed her hand. She had gone on the record with her own voice, she had escalated without board approval, and she had left a paper trail that exposed every step of her misconduct. And when the board finally reviewed that paper trail, they had no choice but to act. The fence is still standing, and so am I. My brother is safe, my credit is intact, and Courtney Taylor is gone. Cedar Pointe has new leadership, new policies, and a new understanding that rules are not leverage. They are guidelines that apply to everyone equally. And if another HOA leader ever tries to pull the same stunt, there are now a dozen homeowners in Cedar Pointe who know exactly how to fight back. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.